Hey, what's going on everybody? Today we're going to be taking a look at my review of the Unifi UDM-Pro or Dream Machine Pro. I finally got my hands on one of these a couple months ago, and I started making videos on it, like the first time setup video. I haven't actually uploaded any of those yet. I really kind of wanted to put some time into getting used to the device, getting it integrated into my own network, and really get a feel for what it could do and how to use it before I actually made a video on it. So this is after I've been using it in my own network for quite a while, and spoiler alert, I'm actually pretty disappointed in it. And don't worry, I'm going to explain why I'm disappointed. It's probably for none of the reasons that anyone else would really be disappointed in it, but I'm coming at this device like from a network engineer standpoint. I work on networks all day long. I work on business networks, enterprise networks, things with a lot of advanced feature sets, which is why I usually gravitate towards the Edge router, because that's a really cheap device that supports a whole lot of actually advanced features that I can use. And the reason that I wanted to go give the UDM a shot is because it looked like it had quite a few of the features that I would need, as well as a lot more speed. It's got the two 10 gig ports. Really, I wanted 10 gigabit and threat detection, because the Edge routers don't do any sort of threat detection at all outside of just a regular firewall. So that's kind of the background here. I'm coming straight from Edge routers and a lot of other advanced devices and trying to make this UDM-Pro my one device for my entire network. And if you want a video basically on a Unifi type device versus Edge router, why one may be more preferable to the other, this is probably a good video for that as well, because I'm going to be directly comparing this to my Edge router 4, which was my daily driver main core piece of equipment up until I put this in. And even though this video is probably going to be me ripping this thing apart, I do want to just say that I will still be using it as my primary device. It is still a good piece of equipment, but I just want to highlight a lot of the stuff that is just kind of baffling to me or missing entirely from this device. So let's just go ahead and get right into this. So first thing I'm going to go over is kind of confusing firewall rules. So if we go into our device settings here and security, we've got our menu here for traffic and firewall rules, and then you've got simple or advanced. Now, advanced is where I spend most of my time, because what I want to do is block traffic to and from my mini VLANs that I have on my network. So like I've got my regular wireless, I've got my management, I've got a guest network, I've got Internet of Things, security, yada yada. And I don't want my guest network being able to access all my other networks, or maybe I want my internal wireless and data center VLANs to only access other certain VLANs. And the way you typically do this on almost any other device is you either use what's called zones or like interface specific rules. So for example, if I go over to my Edge router here and I go into my firewall policies, I've got a whole bunch of individual policies that I have named based on the interface or network that they're serving. So like if I go into my guest in firewall rule set, this is all the rules for guest. If I go into my Internet of Things rule set, this is all my rules for my Internet of Things network. Now on the UDM-Pro or any Unifi device, I'm assuming, because UDM-Pro is really their main security device at this point, you've got all Internet, LAN, guest, and then your IP version 6 rule sets. This is pretty much all you've got. And under each of these, you've got either in, local, out, or an app group. If you notice, I've got many different VLANs, but technically all of them fall within this LAN zone. So any of my networks are going to be under the LAN section, and they'll be under a guest section if I mark the little checkbox that says that that network is a guest network, and that's how it gets into here. So at least to me, this is really confusing, because I have to go under LAN, and then literally all my rules for all of my VLANs have to be under here. And then I just have to manually name them for what network they're actually for. I have to manually create the firewall rules, blocking all traffic to each of these, which I have way at the bottom here. I think, yeah, block all firewall to subnets, block all for Wireguard. So I have to put these in here if I don't want traffic to route between the networks, and then I have to make all of my other firewall rules for each individual network. But they're all under this LAN zone. It's just really hard to look at for me. I think it would be great if they would adopt some sort of a zone-based policy management, similar to like Sonic Wall. Disclaimer, I'm not saying Sonic Wall is awesome or anything. I just wish it had a system kind of like that. Or at least a system where you could do kind of like interface specific stuff. Now, that's not even getting into this simple type, which they kind of push you to use anyway. This I find to be way too confusing and really only applicable if you're trying to allow or block a certain app for basically everything. So, long story short here, I was under the impression that if I made different networks, I would have basically a zone for every network I created, but that is not the case at all. It's just all lumped under the LAN zone. And moving on from that, my next nitpick is NAT. So there is no custom NAT on this device whatsoever. It seems that the only option is just NAT overload for the internet. I have not found any way to do any sort of custom NAT. Now, of course, if you're in a regular home network, you probably have no need for custom NAT, but in a business environment, especially if it's got overlapping subnets or a need for what's called hairpin NAT, this is really something you want to be able to edit. But again, I have found nowhere to do that in here. Now, one good thing is that it does appear that hairpin NAT is pretty much on for everything by default. I actually haven't had an issue with any of my previous hairpin rules I had to set up on the edge router working. So at least there's that it does hairpin by default. But if I wanted to go in and change any specific NATs to say map one IP address to a completely different IP address, that is impossible as far as I've seen. And we can contrast this to the edge router, which all I'd have to do is go to the NAT tab, and then down here I've got a whole lot of destination NATs, which were used for my hairpin configurations, and my source NAT rules up here. So I can pretty much NAT to my little heart's content on this edge router, but there's really not even a mention of NAT in the interface here for the UDM-Pro. And I have read that there is a way to disable NAT, which is also another kind of important thing that you might want to do if this is not going to be your edge gateway device. And the only way I've found to actually disable that is to SSH into it and do a bunch of Linux commands that may or may not be overwritten when you save your device configuration. So maybe if you have any need at all to do any sort of NAT, this might not be the device for you. Like I said, luckily I was kind of able to get around it because hairpin is really the only thing I worried about, and that just seems to work out of the box, at least for what I need it to work for. Now, moving on from NAT, let's take a look at VPNs, which is actually a pretty big section that a lot of people will probably want this for, because you can see it supports a lot of different VPN options. You've got Teleport, which is Unifi's kind of proprietary, simple VPN thing that you can use from the app on your phone and just straight quickly teleport to your device and use it as a VPN. You've got a couple different options for a VPN server. You can use Wireguard, OpenVPN, or L2TP, which you probably shouldn't be using anyway, but it's there. You can also use it as a VPN client. And then you've got site-to-site VPN, which is either OpenVPN or IPsec. So you might notice that there is a little bit of limitation already. Like you can use Wireguard as a VPN server, or basically like a client VPN, dial in. But you cannot use Wireguard in the site-to-site fashion, which on the surface seems fine. That's cool. It supports at least Wireguard client VPN, and we can use OpenVPN or IPsec for our site-to-sites. That's fine. But the configuration of all of these is extremely limited. So if I go in and I try to make a new site-to-site connection, choose between OpenVPN or IPsec, this is basically nothing like an edge router in that you cannot manually configure very many advanced features here. So if I create an IPsec policy, this actually doesn't create any sort of tunnel interface, virtual interface, or like the edge router, it's called VTI, virtual tunnel interface. It doesn't create one of those, which isn't really that much of a problem if you're going like UDM to UDM, because you could just use policy based or even I guess route based. But what happens is, and I'm just going to create a test tunnel here, and we'll say that it's route based, and we'll go ahead and add it. Oh, I forgot to add that network. So let's go ahead and add this tunnel. Let's see, port forward conflicts with 500 and 4500. which, okay, yeah, I can't actually make a test one because of the reasons I'm trying to explain. I actually port forwarded port 500 and 4500 to my older edge router to take care of these VPN tunnels for me. But basically, the problem with this IPsec configuration, especially if you're going to an edge router, is that when you try to actually set up routing to that network, like if we go and we try to make a static route, create an entry, we'll call it tunnel route, give it a distance, destination network, we'll say this was what we were trying to get to. Basically what we need to do is put in a next hop. Now, since it didn't create a virtual interface for us to assign any sort of IP address, this next hop basically has to already be in the routing table, which it can't be because it didn't create that tunnel interface. And if we do an interface route, even if we did create an IPsec tunnel, the VPN interfaces don't show up here. So there's really no way for us to configure routing on this VPN tunnel. And going along with routing for a VPN tunnel, if we go over to OSPF, which I'll get to some more problems with OSPF here in a minute. Now, this is new. I'm actually very lucky that this came out basically the day that I decided to put this thing in my network. So it actually having OSPF has helped a lot, but it is still limited much in the same way that this VPN is. But anyways, if I want to add a VPN interface to use OSPF, I cannot, because any sort of VPN interface is not going to show up here for my selection in OSPF. And also, with the site-to-site VPN, because it didn't create an interface at all, obviously it's not going to show up here. So while it has the ability to do an IPsec site-to-site VPN, you're basically limited to policy only. And as far as I've been able to tell, there is really not a way to get a VPN working, at least an IPsec VPN, between an edge router or a UDM-Pro, just because of the different ways that they create it. And the edge router has all the different commands to create and use the virtual tunnel interfaces, as well as a whole lot of other options, while the UDM side really has no configuration at all. You can't tell it to create an interface or not. You just tell it if it's policy or route based, and then you basically can't create the routes for it anyway. So contrast that with the edge router, where if I go to, say, like routing and OSPF, I have interfaces over here I can add, which is virtual tunnel, OpenVPN interfaces, or virtual tunnel interface, which is IPsec site-to-site interfaces. Now, most of what I just said about site-to-site IPsec also applies to site-to-site OpenVPN. If we try to configure an OpenVPN tunnel here, we'll call it test OVPN, we get down to the pre-shared key, and it does a pretty poor job telling you that you need to generate the entire, 120 or 256-bit key for this externally. It doesn't have the option built in. On the edge router, if you go to the command line, you can just generate the key right there and then point your OpenVPN tunnel to it. Here, you've got to follow this link for instructions on how to generate a key, which involves SSHing to your device, running the OpenVPN generate command, and copying the entire 512 character string into that pre-shared key box. So while, yeah, technically it's kind of the same as doing it on the edge router, it's just you're not really meant to SSH to this thing. That's kind of an avoid at all cost type of thing to be doing with your UDM-Pro, so that's just a little weird. So if I try to generate a key, which I actually did on the edge router, we run into another problem. And that is, at least if we copy and paste directly out of PuTTY, try to put it in here, it gives us the warning, shared secret key must contain 512 alphanumeric characters. So okay, you think maybe it just needed to include these first parts, which is begin and end of the OpenVPN key. Nope, still gives us the same error. So why does it do this? Well, at least when we copy and paste out of PuTTY from an edge router, we get the key, but we also get apparently a whole bunch of spaces in it. So to actually use this key from the edge router, we've got to manually go in here, delete all of these line breaks, just because of the way that it's formatted, then copy and paste it into our key field. So if you do go through all of these instructions to actually generate the key and get it working, and you're using PuTTY, and you try and copy and paste it in there, you'll still probably run into an issue. Now, this at least gives us the option to give us a local tunnel address, so I'm just going to say 10.88.251.33/30 local port. Apparently that's not a valid IP address. Okay, I guess you can't put the slash in there. Whatever. Local port, I know that one overlaps, so we'll just give it like 1295. And then for remote networks, we'll go ahead and try this same 172.16.00.24. And then remote IP address, which is the hostname or IP address of our distant router. We'll just say 1.1.5.6. That's completely made up. And then the remote tunnel IP, 10.88.251.35. And we'll go ahead and match that port. So let's add our test interface here. So now we've got our test OpenVPN thing set up here. The good thing is, if we go to our routing, we can actually create a static route with that interface. It will actually show up in this list. So that's awesome because it actually creates that interface with the local IP that we designated. But what we can't do with our OpenVPN site-to-site is any kind of specific OpenVPN commands. So like a lot of my edge router tunnels, they have a whole bunch of specific OpenVPN parameters for that tunnel. Can't edit any of those here. You've just got a local and a remote IP address. And then also, if you go to OSPF and you want to add that interface into OSPF, say the 10.88.251.32 network that we created, or tried to create for OpenVPN, if we go to select the interface, sorry, OpenVPN is not an option. So can't run OSPF over that VPN tunnel, which was a pretty big bummer for me, but at least we can get static routing more or less working. Now, the last VPN nitpick I have is basically that you can't create multiple VPNs with the same endpoints, which might sound like, duh, you can't do that, and that's typically the case for like policy-based VPNs. But if I wanted to have, say, an IPsec site-to-site VPN to Illini, which I already have an OpenVPN tunnel operational for, if I go to create this VPN with the same endpoint, then what I get is failed saving network. Well, I get port forward conflicts, but if I didn't have that port forward, actually, let's just go ahead and turn that off so we can see the actual error that we're supposed to have. So I'm going to disable my port forward for IPsec and NAT traversal. Go back to the VPN, try to add a second Illini site-to-site as IPsec. So when we click add, we get unable to save configuration. 10.88.113.0 is already, what was that? Already specified as a remote network subnet in Illini. So we cannot have two tunnels to the same endpoint, even if they're using different protocols. So this makes sense on the surface, especially when you take into account the limitations of the VPNs that I've already showed you. So you can't have two different tunnels going to the same endpoint with the same remote network because the UDM doesn't have, or at least it didn't have before OSPF, any way of dynamic routing or setting priorities on those routes. So it's basically like, well, I can't have two routes to the same destination. But in the enterprise networking world, you absolutely can. You can do that using OSPF. On my edge router, I had 3 different tunnels to the same endpoint for all of my endpoints, and that was an IPsec VPN, a Wireguard VPN, and an OpenVPN. And the way that I was able to route between them was using OSPF, and the reason I did that was if one tunnel went down, that route would be pulled from the table and it would automatically back up to the next VPN in line. So if IPsec stopped working for some reason, it would use Wireguard. If Wireguard stopped working, it would use OpenVPN. The protocols and technology and all that is there to do something like that, but the UDM's like, nah, you can't do it. There's no advanced configuration to go anywhere past just creating the tunnel. So I think I've kind of beat that horse a little bit to death, but I have one more VPN-specific gripe to kind of put out there, and that's with the VPN server and the Wireguard configuration. So this is one of the best features, actually, of the UDM-Pro, is the ability to easily set up a Wireguard client VPN. All we got to do is just go in, create, give it a name, and it's not even just Wireguard. You can do OpenVPN, or I wouldn't do L2TP, but the option's there. But if I create a Wireguard client VPN here, I give it the name, I tell it which IP address and port it's going to use. I set up some advanced configuration here if I want to. This is the IP address of the network the clients will connect to, as well as its kind of DHCP pool. Now if I add a client here, and I say client 1, it gives me this cool thing where I can just scan a QR code, download the configuration file, and get going on my phone. Or I can just download the configuration file here if I want to transfer it to a computer. This is awesome, but here's the problem, and it's really dumb. If I want additional routes in my configuration file, so say I want some routes to all of my other statically configured networks that I want to access local to this UDM, that's kind of one of the big things you want to do with a client VPN. If you're VPNing back to your house or business or whatever, you kind of want to access the local resources there. So like say I want to look at my cameras while I'm away, or I want to be able to manage this server that we've got over here. I mean, especially in the business environment, your employees, when they're remoting in, it's basically to use internal network resources from outside the company network. So you're going to want more additional routes in here because by default, your Wireguard is basically set up just to use routes for this like 192.168.3 network that it has configured, and then it has a route all option as well, which typically we don't want to use. I'll get to that in a second. But anyways, if I add all these additional routes, they show up down here. We'll say 172.16.00/24. So I've added these two. That's cool. Let's go ahead and click add. Wait a minute, save your configuration file or scan the QR code now. So for security reasons, you cannot download this configuration file once you leave this page. What's funny about this is these routes that we just configured as additional routes, they don't get added to that configuration file until we click add. So here we're in kind of a conundrum where we're configuring additional routes that we want to be in our configuration file, but we can't download that file after we click add. What? So if I download this Wireguard configuration file and I open it up in a notepad, you can see it still just has those two routes for our Wireguard network as well as a route all. Now technically this route all will get all the traffic for any network you want to put in as an additional route, but we also want to take that out later, which is another gripe, that you don't have the option to do that. So when you create a Wireguard VPN with that all zeros configuration here at the end, which is default, that's a tunnel all VPN. That means you're no longer using whatever internet connection or DNS servers or anything that you're currently on for anything. All of your internet traffic is going to be routed through this Wireguard VPN server, which can be beneficial or wanted in some situations, but a lot of times you're going to want to set up what's called a split tunnel, where if you're browsing to YouTube or Netflix or whatever on your remote device, it's not using the VPN because you have an internet connection already. You can access those sites directly. They have nothing to do with the internal network, so they really don't need to be funneled through this tunnel unless you're wanting to just use the security services that the UDM-Pro provides. That's one of the situations where maybe you might want this, but for me, I don't like it. And the main complaint is that even if I configure anything in this menu, it is not going to be put in the configuration file because I can't download it after I've seen this menu. I'm actually not even sure if the IP address changing or regenerating the public key works either. Let me see here. Actually, no, it looks like those do actually update the configuration file, but the allowed IPs, they don't. So basically, when I set up my Wireguard server on this, I just go in, I add the client, I give it a name, go to manual, just go ahead and download it with the default settings, click add, and then I just go in here and delete that out and then add any of the specific routes that I want for my network and call it a day, because it really doesn't matter what's configured on this other end. It's just going to accept the routes from this configuration file anyway, which is kind of another thing. You want access to everything on the network by default, which I mean, obviously you've got that tunnel all that was there by default, so yeah, you have access to everything right away, but your firewall rules are automatically open. So you need to have firewall rules set up to any networks you don't want to be able to access, because anybody can edit this file and put in a network that you might not want them to access. And if you don't have that rule set up, then they just have access to it. Now, another thing that kind of goes along with Wireguard is this pool right here, this gateway and subnet for your hosts. Actually, we can't change that since we already have a client added, but if I want to say this should be on one of my LANs, well, it can't overlap with the network that's already created on this device. So you can't have a pool of IP addresses that are a part of an already made network. This is something that I like to do on SonicWall devices, just give the VPN clients a little subset of IP addresses from the main network so it looks like they're actually on that main network. This isn't anything like super bad on its own, but this is going to feed into my complaints with OSPF later, because you can't add this to your OSPF advertised routes because it doesn't create an interface for it. So you're stuck with static routing to this tunnel if you need that. And if that's as clear as mud, it's probably because I'm the only one that does something like that, but I'll hit on kind of how I got around this specific issue here in a minute. But also, last thing I promised about VPNs, and that's the firewall rules to them. Again, I think the firewall rules are just confusing on their own, but the firewall rules to WireGuard I think are even more confusing. And the reason for that is because what zone does WireGuard go into by default? Is it internet? Is it LAN? Is it guest? On other devices, typically you have like a VPN or a client VPN zone for firewall rules. And to me, when I think about it, a VPN connection doesn't really fit into any of these. It's not technically on the LAN, it's not a guest interface, it's technically kind of on the internet, but it doesn't fall into that category really. So basically, it's on the LAN. It's a part of the LAN rules. But when you go and try to set it up, when you don't have any rules created at all, you come in here and you're like, well, where do I put this? Which zone? Well, I figured out you put it in LAN, and I just named it WireGuard. So that's the last on the VPN. That's done and over with. So let's take a look at the next thing I want to talk about, and that is SNMP. So if you don't know what that is, it's Simple Network Management Protocol. It's really just a way to monitor a device from an external server, get information such as like bandwidth usage and other statistics about your device that you might want to monitor somewhere else. And what I use that for is my Libre NMS monitoring system, where I can look at the health of my devices, whether or not they're online, CPU usage, all that, which also gives me the ability to make this beautiful network map where I can see the bandwidth utilization of pretty much anything in my network. So for me, SNMP is a pretty nice feature to have, and luckily Unifi supports that, with one glaring limitation. If I go into System and Advanced, and I go down to SNMP monitoring, which can be done on any Unifi access point and stuff like that. I set up monitoring for all of my access points. These are TP-Link that I have right now, but it works the same for Unifi access points. If I go in here and I set up my typical monitoring version 3, give it the username, the password, my typical Unifi gripe, this isn't a gripe with the UDM-Pro itself, but with Unifi, is that you don't know if this is auth or auth priv or both or whatnot, or what protocols it's using to authenticate. That's kind of easy to Google and figure out. I can get that working no problem. But what's this little I around here? Oh, unsupported devices, December waters. That is my UDM-Pro. So in reality, Unifi devices support SNMP, but not the UDM-Pro. To enable SNMP on the UDM-Pro, you have to do basically the same thing if you want to enable anything advanced. You have to go into SSH and basically set up SNMP just as you would on any other Linux box. So why in the world Unifi has SNMP on every other device that they make except the UDM-Pro is just baffling to me. So obviously you can see I did get it set up. I did have to SSH into the UDM-Pro. And I did all of that stupid configuration that I shouldn't have to do because the option's literally right here and it works for every other device except this one. Now, let's talk about one of the things that I've already mentioned a whole lot, especially in the VPN rant that I just went on, and that's OSPF. So OSPF is one of those things that you're probably never going to touch. Half of anybody I talk to that uses these don't even know what OSPF does. But if you have the need for it, seeing that it's supported is awesome. And luckily this just came out. This is a pretty new feature. Maybe they're going to make some changes or updates to it. So I might be a little early to this party, but typically if you see a device supports OSPF, you kind of have a general expectation of how that's going to work if you've ever worked with OSPF before. Now, I do have it set up, and getting it working was a little bit wonky. I had to reboot routers a couple different times. They weren't showing up as neighbors. I have a neighborship between my old Edge Router 4 and this UDM-Pro. I'm not entirely sure it was the UDM-Pro's fault at not establishing the neighborship. It could also have been the Edge router being stupid, but when you turn on OSPF and put in the same networks on each side, you kind of just expect it to show up as a neighbor, and it didn't. So I had to do a whole bunch of finagling to really get it to show up, but again, I'm not really sure that it was the UDM's fault. But the rest of these issues kind of are. And number one is if I look at my OSPF configuration, like cool, I got my router ID, I've got my areas. If I click on my areas, I can see which networks I am advertising into it. And then I've got my interfaces that are a part of the OSPF network. Now, I've already talked about how you can't add any other type of interface into this, like a VPN interface. That OpenVPN tunnel that I have actually working can't be advertised into OSPF because I can't select it. My Wireguard client VPN can't be advertised into OSPF because, again, the interface doesn't show up. But also, where are my routes? What routes have I got from OpenVPN? Where are my neighbors? Who am I peered with? Where is any of that basic information here? When I'm running OSPF, I want to see who my neighbors are. It'd be great to see the OSPF database and like what routes I'm receiving from them, but okay, that is a little bit advanced. But I'd also like to see, I don't know, my OSPF routes, or at least a routing table in general. Let's just say I want to see my IP routes. Where is that? Well, I got policy-based routes. It's not here. Static routes. Okay, here's all the routes that I have manually put in. Cool. And OSPF, which doesn't show me any routes at all, except for the networks I should be advertising. Where is my routing table? This is a router and a firewall. Why can I not view the actual routing table and see what routes I have received from OSPF? If I have multiple different paths for an OSPF route, how can I see which one is active? This is just kind of a simple thing that I feel like I should be able to look at in here, and it's just not present. And it does say up here, if you're setting up a site-to-site VPN alongside OSPF, consider using Site Magic instead. This is kind of like a, hey, we get it, this kind of sucks right now. At least that's how I read this. Like, hey, maybe you should use a different method if you want OSPF running over a VPN. Anyways, I would at least at the bare minimum want to see my neighbors and my routes. If I'm on my Edge router and I go to my routing tab, here's a list of all the routes in my routing table. I can see what the destination is, what the interface is on, the next hop address, whether it's a static or OSPF, whether it's in the forwarding database, which means it's active or not. Very useful information you want to know about your routing environment. If I go to the OSPF tab, I can see that I have my two areas, sure, my router ID, and I've got all my interfaces. Now, no, I don't actually see my neighbors here, which is something that I would like to see on this page, but so even the Edge router doesn't give me all the information I would necessarily want, but I do have the option to go into SSH, which I use for other setup quite frequently, and do a show IP OSPF neighbor and get that information. Now, going back to our UDM-Pro, we do have the ability to redistribute static or connected routes. And if we check that, we can select if it's a external type 1 or an external type 2 route. Cool. But usually if you're getting into the realm of static redistribution or redistribution in general, you kind of want to set some custom metrics, especially if you're dealing with multiple paths to the same network. You kind of want to modify the advertised cost of routes like that, which you can't do, obviously. It's just either external 1 or external 2. So the way that I got around this whole OSPF thing, because it really wouldn't work too well in the environment that I had set up, was I kept my old Edge router and I just basically did all of the OSPF on this. So for example, for my Wireguard client network, I put a static route in on my Edge router, and then I redistributed that with a metric of 10 and a metric type of 1 throughout the rest of my OSPF network. So instead of doing it on the UDM-Pro itself. I just did it on the device I was used to, and you had all of the advanced configuration options that I needed. And you might be thinking, well, I mean, you could just redistribute connected or redistribute static from here. But if I redistribute connected, that's going to give all of the networks configured on this UDM-Pro authorization to be advertised throughout the OSPF network, which I do not want. I've only got 2 configured here that I want advertised, well, 3 really. The rest of them, I don't want all the other routers to have a route to, such as my security VLAN, guest VLAN, and all of that. If I selected redistribute connected, it would go ahead and do that. And I could do redistribute static, but as we've kind of maybe already seen, I have a bunch of other static routes that I don't really want to be put into the OSPF network either. So that's why I use the Edge Router 4 basically for any type of OSPF config past the bare minimum. Alright, so now let's take a look at content filtering, or some of our security services. So for each network, we have the ability to enable certain security services like ad blocking, country restrictions, or GEO-IP filtering. You can add DNS shield and suspicious activity monitoring. So I like to have all of these on. Ad blocking is great for regular simple networks. If I go to my network inspection thing, you can see I have a ton of ad blocks happening all the time because I have this enabled on one of my main networks. But if this were a business environment and I have an Active Directory server or internal DNS of any kind, what this doesn't tell you is that if you have ad blocking enabled on that network, it basically hijacks the DNS for it and uses a Unifi specific ad blocking DNS, much like a Pi-hole. But that's a DNS server that you can't configure. It doesn't even tell you the address of it. You don't know that it's doing that when you enable it until you try to go to internal IP addresses. Like, for example, this network map I got to, I used the IP to access it because I would typically go to HTTP monitor.lan, but it can't be reached. And that is because ad blocking is set up on this network and it's using some obscure DNS server to do the ad blocking for it. Now with something like the Pi-hole, it uses the same concept, except for the Pi-hole you can actually go in and configure what's called conditional forwarding. So it's like, hey, I've got this internal network or internal domain that I have my own DNS server for. So like the domain LAN, I want to be able to use internal DNS for anything that is on the LAN domain. With other solutions for ad blocking, you have the ability to configure that in. So it'll use the ad blocking rules, block everything you want it to, but if it's for an internal domain, it gets forwarded elsewhere. That is not an option in here. So if you're in, say, a company environment and you think that ad blocking would be pretty cool, just know that you're basically going to shoot yourself in the foot for resolving any internal DNS entries. And there's more than one way around this pretty simple problem. Conditional forwarding is one that I've already mentioned, but you could also just change the upstream DNS server where, say, cool, Unifi hijacks the DNS, it does its ad blocking. All right, let's set up the next DNS server down the line to be our internal one. Yeah, that option doesn't exist either. One of the ways you typically get around this is to change DNS for, say, your primary WAN connection. But if I go in here and I deselect auto for DNS server, and say I put in my 2 primary DNS servers, which are actually Active Directory servers, and I try to resolve it, I still get the exact same behavior. So obviously the ad blocking does not pull from the primary WAN's DNS servers, and it's just got its own configured. So if you know of a way to get around that specific issue, I would love to hear it, but as far as I'm concerned, you cannot use ad blocking in any sort of production environment where you have custom DNS set up somewhere else. So what I did was I just applied it to all of the networks, which really I don't care if it can resolve internal DNS or not, and just went with that. Now, kind of related to the ad blocking is the content filtering, and that is basically, I think that's on the network tab. Let's see. Yeah, content filtering, you've got none, work, or family. So here I've got basically my kids' network called Rugrats, and I have it set up for family content filtering. And this is kind of a minor gripe, but I wish that I could set this kind of per device. Like, select a device in the clients tab or something and just say, hey, I want content filtering applied to that one, but not necessarily all of the devices on the network. It's not something you can do. It's basically a blanket configuration for the entire network. And you can actually kind of get around this specific issue by creating some traffic rules for app groups or whatnot using this simple firewall rule creation thing. But then you're basically setting up your own content filter anyway. Like, there's no real benefit to having an automated one if you're just going to manually configure all the rules yourself. So it almost ends up being more work than it's worth if you want to apply content filtering to just a single device. So what I did was I just made my kids their own network, applied the family content filtering to it, and called it a day. But another thing that I would like to see in addition to that is some kind of explanation on exactly what this is blocking. I mean, this little thing says it blocks VPNs, explicit, pornographic, and malicious domains, and that it sets search engines and YouTube to safe mode. Awesome, cool. What if there's something that I think they should be able to access that this doesn't? Well, I can go in and I can create that firewall rule, but I would like to see some sort of menu that's like, hey, you can access this but not that, or like, say I want to turn the safe search off. There's really, you don't get any of that. You don't get any customization. It's just family and that's it. So kind of a minor gripe, but again, kind of follows the same theme of, yeah, the feature is there, the feature is awesome, but good luck if you want to customize anything about it at all. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is honestly very baffling to me. When I installed this, I was like, cool, I have a Unifi controller console, I can manage all of my devices with it. So what I have is quite a few Unifi access points and switches and whatnot that are located in different areas over those VPN tunnels that you probably saw when I was talking about VPNs. And the way I have my current Unifi controller set up is with multiple sites, because that's what you do. You have a site for each, site that you want to manage. Each site has its own networks, its own wireless networks, its own configurations. So I was like, awesome, I can just move all of that to my UDM-Pro. No, you cannot. On the UDM-Pro, for some reason, and this is talked about at length online, it seems like nobody understands why they didn't put this in here, but you cannot enable multi-site management on a UDM-Pro. You are limited to a single site. Why? Technically, I could take all my devices and merge them into this, and then I would have all my devices that are on a whole bunch of different sites under one, and then I would have to contend with AP groups and which networks are assigned to which groups, and all of that headache that multi-site management just takes care of for you. So why does the UDM-Pro run the Unifi network application, but missing one of the biggest features that it has everywhere else? So if you were planning on using your UDM-Pro as kind of like a really big cloud key, nah, not really. At least not if you have more than one site. Now the next thing we're going to move on to is kind of the security features and inspection. Not really the features themselves, but the reporting on them. So if I want to look at what my security rules and all that are doing, I can go to the Networks and Inspection tab, and I can see that I've got all my clients down here. I've got my EdgeRouter 4, it's had 1,000 threat blocks, cool, no ad blocks. My living room TV, it's had a whole bunch of ad blocks. I can sort by the ad blocks or the threat blocks, but say I want to see those threat blocks. Let's say, what is this one threat that it blocked for my Unraid server here? It's got a link, I can click on this number 1, but if I click on it, it just takes me to the Security Detections tab. I was under the impression that if I clicked the 1 next to my Unraid server, it would show me the threat that was detected for that server. But it doesn't matter which one I click on. I could click on a threat block of 0. It's going to take me to the exact same menu in the exact same place. If I want to see that detection, I have to manually search for it. So why do we have all of these individual links for threat blocks if they just take us to the exact same menu that I could literally just browse to first by going to the system log and security detections? Now, okay, yeah, that's a very minor gripe, like, oh, the link doesn't take me where I think it should take me. But in general, the security information you get is pretty surface level. Now, these threat blocks are pretty okay. If I go into the threat block or security detections log, and I click on any one of these, it'll give me the signature that was used, the detection category, kind of a little overview of it, and then the source and destination IP address, which is very useful. So like this device using port 39544 was trying to access this device on port 161, and it was blocked because it was a part of GPL SNMP public access. Which, sure, if you're not running SNMP, you don't really want people trying to launch attacks using it against your network, because a lot of devices have public SNMP community set up by default, and people can just grab a whole lot of information from that device without you ever knowing it. So that is pretty useful. But if we go to the triggers tab, which is basically like a security detections except for your firewall rules that you manually set, we can see a whole lot of almost the same type of information. So we can see our Edge Router 4 was blocked from accessing this IP by firewall rule, block all firewall subnets. Awesome, I made that rule. I wanted it to block all. This was not specifically allowed, so cool. But let's say I have a device that I want to be able to access something. Like say this scone was blocked from accessing this IP by firewall rule, block all. So let's go ahead and look at that. We've got the client, which is scone, and I could click on that and get my client information. That's just a desktop PC I have on my network. I can see its IP address, and then I have a port number. But what was it trying to access? What was the destination? I have the firewall rule that blocked it. I have when it was applied, and then I have a destination of firewalled subnets, which is, yeah, that's what was configured in the firewall rule. Cool. But I don't have source and destination information like I did on the security detections. Like specifically, what was this trying to access on this device? And for example, why this would be a little frustrating is I have DNS servers on my main network that are allowed to every other network. But every other network cannot access anything other than DNS on that device. So if we took, for example, this Honey Surface was trying to access this IP, just imagine this is a DNS server, and I go and look at it, and I'm like, huh, I made a traffic rule to allow DNS to this device. Why is it saying this is being blocked? Well, was it trying to access DNS, or was it trying to access HTTP, HTTPS, or any other service that was on that device? It'd be cool for me to know that, so that I can troubleshoot this firewall rule a little bit more effectively. Also, in the same realm of security features, if we go to, well, let me see if I remember where it is, I think statistics. Yeah, okay, so we can see our traffic statistics, that's awesome. If we go to Geo, this shows a map of the entire world and how much traffic is going to and from your network from each country, which is great. If I click on United States, I can see I've used 49.6 gigabytes. If I look at Germany, I can see I've got 44 megabytes. If I see a country that's like, why do I have a whole lot of traffic going over here when it shouldn't? It's cool because I can decline traffic, and that will add that country to the GEO-IP blocking list. Cool. But what's one piece of information that I might want to see? Maybe traffic from blocked countries that's been trying to get in, or like a counter of how much traffic has been blocked due to this GEO-IP filtering. There's really none of that. I can't see any traffic information for any country I have blocked, so I don't really know how much of this is actually taking effect. All I have is the option to allow that country, and then it will show me how much traffic is going to it. But I mean, maybe it's just me, but I like to see what my security rules are doing. Like, do I have a stupid amount of traffic that I was missing that was being blocked from Brazil? And this again might seem like a pretty minor issue. Like, sure, I don't know how much traffic is being blocked from the countries. Do I care if it's actually being blocked? No, probably not. But what happens when I have a problem with this? So say I start using a new app or a service or something, and it, for some reason, is hosted in Australia. How do I go about troubleshooting that? For example, I use an app called AnyType, which, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's basically like one of those second brain apps, or it's kind of similar to OneNote in a way, but it's how I keep track of all my videos and other personal things and documents and notes and whatnot. And it syncs between different devices, and it's supposed to be all local and then just peer-to-peer between your devices. However, there is apparently a server that it must have connection to in order to sync these notes. Now, that's probably a video all in itself as to why AnyType needs access to this certain server, but it was in another country, and it was in a country I had blocked. So I was wondering why my AnyType app would just never sync. And if I went into my Unifi controller, I can't see how much traffic is being blocked to a certain country. I can't see if I'm actively having connections there. I also can't see any GEO-IP blocks in the threat detection list or inspection. If I go to the log, GEO-IP blocks do not show up in security detections or triggers. So I don't have a running log or any type of list that's saying, hey, a certain device was blocked from accessing this country because it was GEO-IP filtered. There's nowhere that I've found to see this information. So when trying to troubleshoot an app that's not working because its server is in another country, you basically have to manually do some investigation, like set up a Wireshark packet capture and see what IPs that app is trying to communicate with, and then kind of Google them. I ended up Googling or finding the IP that this was trying to communicate with, Googling it, and I actually couldn't do it through Wireshark because I have so many apps communicating at the same time, and I'm not good enough to narrow it down to a single app. So I ended up finding the IP somewhere in AnyType's privacy policy, Googled that, said it was in Germany. Germany was already allowed. So then I was like, well, that's not helpful because it should already be working. Well, I found another part of the privacy policy that was like, no, we use various services hosted in the EU. So all right, let's Google all the countries that are in the EU and start randomly turning them on. Well, I ended up digging it down by trial and error to Switzerland. Oh, that's not Switzerland, that's the Netherlands. Switzerland. So that is where my AnyType application has to connect to for some reason to sync. Now that's probably more of a complaint on AnyType as to why it's supposed to be locally stored and peer-to-peer only, but I have to communicate with Switzerland for it to work. That's a whole other thing in itself. But main point of that is if you're trying to troubleshoot GEO-IP filtering because you enabled it thinking it was awesome, but then come to find out one of your critical apps actually uses a server in another country that you just blocked, there's not a really easy way to tell. And this is obviously not applicable to the edge router because it doesn't have anything like GEO-IP filtering, but on a device like a Sonic Wall, it'll log which connections are being blocked by GEO-IP filtering. It'll give you a graph of what are the top blocked countries that you're communicating with. If you go in and perform a packet capture, which you can do on the device, by the way, it will show you what traffic is being blocked and whether or not it was from a firewall rule. Now, admittedly, on a Sonic Wall, the reporting on which firewall rule is blocking it is abysmal, but at least it has that capability to show you that something is being blocked and a rough idea of what is blocking it. And that's pretty much most of my main, I guess you could call it operational complaints with it. Kind of the main gist is that a lot of this stuff, when you see it says it's supported, you're like, okay, cool, I've used that before, I can do it. I know how this works, but then you get in there to actually configure it and realize that it is completely just really dumbed down and there's no customization at all really. So like I see OSPF, I think awesome, I can put that in there just like any other OSPF device. No, I can't even see what neighbors I am peered with or what routes I'm receiving. I see that I can set up an open VPN site to site, or I can see that I have an option of Wireguard, OpenVPN, IPsec, and L2TP, all as VPN technologies. However, I can only have OpenVPN and IPsec as site to site, Wireguard as server. Oh, also I can't really edit that configuration file for Wireguard and then download it if I have specific changes I want, and by default it tunnels everything. Oh, if I try to do an IPsec VPN, I cannot set up a tunnel interface. I also can't use OSPF over any of them. Just a lot of stuff around that kind of general subject is my main complaint about this device, is that it does support a lot of this stuff at a very surface level that, at least for me, makes it unusable in a business or enterprise type environment. Now, I do have a few other things I want to mention, such as more kind of enterprise features or just Unifi application gripes in general. I like that they have set up a lot of more advanced features such as OSPF. Like just having that option saved me a ton of time in static routing. I'm not even sure if I could have integrated it like I did if it didn't have OSPF, even if it is at the most basic level. And I like that they're putting that in there. And there's also a feature that's coming, or apparently is already here, for high availability. That is also something that I have kind of griped about on Unifi devices in the past, is that they're always a single point of failure. There's no real high availability to it, so you can't use it in business critical applications unless you are fine with that single point of failure. at least with an edge router, I can set up VRRP or something and have redundant gateways. Sure, it's not true high availability between two firewalls, but it is a form of redundancy. So something that they introduced for the UDM-Pro recently is called shadow mode, and it says shadow mode gateway high availability. I see this article, I'm like, awesome, they put high availability onto the edge router, but I don't have to read very far to see currently shadow mode operates as a warm spare. That is not high availability at all. And warm spare, even to me, is a little, I mean, it's technically correct, but if I had to name it something, I'd call it cold spare plus, if I had to give it a name. And the reason for that is shadow mode, it just connects to a second UDM-Pro, which is in default configuration. And if the primary goes offline for any sort of time at all, so say there's a failure on this one that they have kind of grayed out, then what happens is you get a prompt on the device screen of the secondary that's like, hey, do you want to fail over? And then you have to physically initiate it. So you have to be right there in front of the device to initiate the failover. It's not automatic. And then even when you initiate the failover, all it really does is it loads the latest backup to the secondary device and it boots it up. And if you have anything in the primary, like a hard disk for Unifi Protect or anything, you have to physically move it to the secondary. And even in the guide, I'm not sure if it's in this one or another one I read, but it's not even recommended to have a drive in the second one because you're supposed to basically move everything from the primary over. So in reality, this just kind of means that that second UDM-Pro is a glorified connectivity monitor. You still have to physically initiate the failover and restore it from a backup, and really it's just that you only need to click a couple buttons to restore it instead of like removing the device from storage, booting it up, and restoring it yourself. But the whole process is generally the same. It's pretty much just like having a UDM-Pro in a closet somewhere, then bringing it out, turning it on, restoring a backup, and swapping the hard drive. The only thing you don't have to do is rack mount it and all of that because it's already there, monitoring the connection, and it kind of just does it by clicking a couple buttons and you don't have to worry yourself with it. But calling it high availability is a stretch. And I do know it says currently it operates as a warm spare. This is a newer feature, they're working on it, it's probably going to get better. Hopefully it gets to real high availability at some point. If it does, I'll probably purchase a second UDM-Pro for that feature, but as it stands right now, this really, I don't know, it bothers me that it's called high availability when it is anything but. But again, kind of a minor gripe because that is a new feature, and it's almost like it's a beta feature. Now, my last nitpicks are just kind of using the Unifi interface in general. This has nothing to do specifically with the UDM-Pro itself. It's just more of having everything in a Unifi environment, and that's stuff like some of the clients being misreported in here. I've had a lot of instances where I go to look at a certain device, and I'll like click on it, and it'll say it's on a completely different network than it's actually connected to. The IP address will say, like we'll say this one says it's 10.88.88.241, but I'm physically on that device and it's 10.88.28.241 or something. There's a lot of information in here that can sometimes get confused or misreported, and it makes you lose a little bit of trust in the device itself. And because there's no manual way to get in there and look at stuff like a routing table, MAC address table, or other tables that are generally used in network troubleshooting that you might be more used to, just kind of makes the experience of troubleshooting really anything just a little bit more painful than it should be. And another gripe is SSH Access. So like I've said, you can enable more advanced features through SSH. It's kind of dumb because you have to do that and there's no actual like router operating system. It's just straight Linux. And then any of the changes that you make in there might probably be overwritten the next time the device either reboots or you save configuration in the GUI. But all of that aside, even just enabling SSH access to get to it is a little confusing. So if we go to System and Advanced, just kidding, it's on the device itself. So we go to Console Settings, we scroll down, we've got Advanced, we have our little SSH checkbox. So we mouse over this, it tells us what SSH is, sure, and we get the option to change a password. Well, what's the username? There's no option to set an SSH username or anything like that. So this just makes me assume what the username for SSH is. Is that my Ubiquiti online account? Is it a local account that I created on here? Is it just admin? No, it is root. It doesn't tell you that it's root, and it makes sense that it's root since this is technically running Linux. But if I'm enabling SSH, and I know how SSH works, I know that I need a username and a password, so why doesn't it tell me that the username is root? Or why doesn't it at least give me the option to create a username? You just have to assume what it is or Google it until you find it. And the last nitpick I had listed was just kind of general stability issues. I have noticed since I put this in, the internet has gone out more than it typically does. Not really sure why. But if I look at the dashboard, well, it's not showing it here, but if I look at it in the console, there'll be like some blips. I'll get quite frequent notifications of my internet being unavailable, which I never noticed before with my Edge Router 4. Maybe it was because I just didn't get notified when it happened, but I do know that I've had a lot more weird issues with like DNS resolution or just connectivity in general going a little wonky for a few minutes. Very minor stuff, nothing breaking about it, but just issues that I didn't have when it was just the Edge Router 4. And I'm sure a lot of it isn't directly the UDM-Pro's fault. It's probably some of my other servers or something else in the network having a problem with being on the UDM now. But I had that listed just because, yeah, it doesn't feel like it got better with the UDM-Pro. It feels like it got a little worse. And that is pretty much the end of my long rant on the UDM-Pro. So again, I know this whole video is kind of like just me taking a dump on this Unifi Dream Machine. It really is a great device. If you're running a pretty simple network or even something a little bit more advanced with like multiple VLANs and stuff like that, this thing is great. It's got the threat detection, the ability to make the VLANs and DHCP and whatnot, and it's got the 10 gig interfaces, which is one of the main reasons I got it for. But just know if you are considering this for business or enterprise type environments, especially those that you've already configured other devices for and you're looking to replace it with a UDM-Pro, just know that a lot of the features come with caveats, and that just because it supports some of the advanced features doesn't mean that it supports them well or in any sort of custom fashion at all. And this is a pretty good example of Unifi versus Edge Router, where the Edge Router clearly has more customization, more features, more granularity to it, which also means it's more complex. But then it comes down to your Edge Router only has a pretty crappy CPU, while this UDM-Pro is really beefy and it runs security services as well. So kind of pick your poison. Do you want those security services and quite a bit of processing power to go along with it, or do you want the advanced, more enterprise-centric features in the background like VRRP, OSPF that actually works like OSPF, the ability to troubleshoot like you would any other enterprise device with your tables, your MAC address tables, your IP routing, your ability to show OSPF neighbors if you have them, your ability to configure multiple VPN tunnels to the same endpoint, yada yada yada, the list goes on. So my general consensus is I like this device, I like the interface, the performance is great, but I was really hoping that it would replace my Edge Router 4 and not just add to it, which it didn't even come close to doing. On my network weather map here, you can see I still have this ER Illini, that's my Edge Router 4, I still have that in the mix. And that takes care of pretty much all of my VPN tunnels still, as well as OSPF. Most of the other stuff I was able to get done with the UDM-Pro, like the firewall rules, but again, those were confusing when I first started looking at them. I still think that it's way too complex to set up firewall rules. You have to use the advanced tab to even get to what I call basic firewall rules, but that's beside the point. But anyways, I think I've rambled on for long enough. This is a super long video, and hopefully this kind of shows you a little bit of what the UDM does well and what it doesn't. Obviously, I know I talked about pretty much what it doesn't do well, but hopefully if you were considering this in any of these type of situations I mentioned, that you have a little bit more knowledge going forward and you can make a little bit better of a decision. So again, as always, I hope you learned something, and also as always, happy networking.